Welcome to Ideagen TV, live on LinkedIn Live and powered by Azure. Today we have with us a very special guest on Ideagen TV, Jake Sotiriadis from the United States Air Force, who's Chief of Strategic Foresight and Futures Analytics at the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability Unit. Jake, welcome.
George, good morning. Thanks so much for having me and for the kind invitation.
Well, what an incredible moment in time, Jake, to be conducting this interview. Clearly, it is a very serious moment, but yet at some level, a hopeful moment and a reflective moment in time as we think about what's happening across the planet. I'd love to hear for our global audience, what brought you to the United States Air Force? What is your professional background? And tell us a little bit about your work in strategic foresight. Sounds incredible and it sounds apropos. So I think our listeners across the planet would love to hear more about what you're working on.
Absolutely. Well, strategic foresight and future studies really is a way of thinking to develop anticipatory thinking to be able to make better decisions. That's really what it is in a nutshell. It's a way to try and look at weak signals that may be coming out of areas that aren't necessarily your core mission set or even your organization's core function, and trying to see how all of those events or all of those phenomena that are occurring may actually relate back to your organization's mission. How do you react to that? How do you develop alternative futures of what might happen to then be able to make better decisions? And so when we talk about futurism, I want to make sure that our listeners are really clear. This isn't predicting the future. So the future doesn't exist. There are many possible futures. And any serious futurist or foresight practitioner will acknowledge that. And so the intent here is, forecasting is really more in the financial realm where people are looking at oil prices and economic dynamics. Futures thinking really is a way of building an awareness of things that are happening in the broader strategic environment, and then distilling those issues down in a way that allows you to apply it to your organization. And this isn't just related to the military, right? This is the private sector, this is industry, this is really almost, you can talk about the healthcare industry. There's a broad application here.
That's right. And, it has to be an incredible journey to get to where you're sitting.
Absolutely. So, you asked before a bit about my background. And so, I grew up in New England. My grandparents came over from Greece. My father was born in Greece as well. And that their attitudes in terms of coming to the United States and what coming to this country really meant to them, the opportunities that this country has given them to start businesses, to educate their families, really, really resonated with me because I grew up hearing constantly from my immigrant grandparents, God bless America, this is the greatest country in the world. And so as I was growing up, I was hearing those things, and it really influenced my decision to go into the military because it's a way of giving something back, and it's a way of acknowledging everything this country has done for me and my family, and also the opportunities that I want to give to my children as well, and to the next generation.
It's really incredible. We've talked a lot in recent interviews in the middle of this global pandemic about the sense of resiliency that emanates from situations like this. And the American people are so resilient, and moments like this create that galvanization of togetherness in a sense, and we're in a shared experience. And in this case, we're actually in a global experience. I mean, it's the experience, I think, globally is the same, which is really fascinating. And from a future standpoint, as you're looking at preparedness and you're looking at the foresight component, it must be interesting, to say the least, to be considering, and I'm sure you've all considered this in the past, what would happen if, from a national security standpoint. As we're looking at this outbreak, this global pandemic, how are you and your colleagues adjusting to the situation? And how has technology played a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, I think that the current situation that's unfolding right now for all of us, I couldn't make a better case for the importance, the criticality of building futures and foresight practices into sort of the everyday operations across the board, in particular in the military realm and national security. When we talk about situations like this, I think it's really important that we get to the level of creating a foresight culture that really operates sort of like an operating system in the background of an organization. It's constantly there. It becomes part of the culture of the organization. It doesn't work so well when people want to use it sort of like an app and just say, well, let me just get some futures analytics and let me just hit this button. It doesn't really work that way.
Right.
It's much better when we have a trained cadre of folks, skilled practitioners who understand the analytic methodologies behind this and understand which weak signals to look for to build the trend analysis and then build what we want to call preferred futures, right? Because ultimately the point of all of this is to be able to shape a better future. To your question about technology, I mean, there's no doubt that today, I mean, we've made a transformation just over the last weeks to become a digital nation. Over 100 million people are now doing what we're doing, which is communicating virtually. People are using Zoom calls now, conference calls. They're finding a new way of doing business. And so the question is, what types of implications does this new reality have for what happens next? The implications for higher education, the implications for healthcare, the implications for the economic realm, and obviously in the security realm where we're focused. How does this affect how we will conduct operations in the future? What skill sets are we going to need to develop in the future to sort of adjust to this? And then the question really becomes, do we go back ultimately to the old way of doing business? And I think that question is still there. And these are the reasons why we want to have foresight practitioners who are building alternative future scenarios that examine the implications of what's happening. Because pandemics are something that have been part of human history. This is certainly not a new phenomenon. I think the biggest challenge for us right now in our society is that it's really the disruption to our day-to-day activities. It's this disruption that we aren't used to.
That's right. And you said it so incredibly articulate in terms of the problem and the fact that it's not the first time humanity has faced a global pandemic. And at the same time, this disruption results in perhaps potentially some more efficiency in some way. As we discussed, and you aptly mentioned, 100 million people are now online. And the system seems to be holding up with all of the streaming and all of the conversations taking place in the digital framework. Shifting a bit, what, Jake, do you see? You're able to see around corners, right? Your foresight is you're able to see perhaps alternative futures. And I really like the way you described it by saying the future doesn't exist. So you're sort of helping to write multiple futures, right? You're helping to create a vision of multiple futures. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing the United States as we look towards these alternative futures to shape the joint force of tomorrow?
That's a great question, George. And I think that, it's a multifaceted one. And so I would break it down this way. When I came into the military in 2003, so I'm an intelligence officer by trade, so I'm an intelligence analyst who worked in the intelligence community as well as the Air Force over the last 17 years. And so that experience has given me, I think, some insight into how not only intelligence analysis happens, but then how to apply foresight. When I came into the Air Force, the primary focus, the main mission in terms of our strategic outlook was really winning the global war on terrorism. And for those officers and those military members that came in around the same time, we've spent the majority of our careers essentially winning that fight, prosecuting that fight. Over the last 2 years, though, there's been a shift in thinking, and now we're in this era of great power competition, where we're looking at this global competition between actors such as China and Russia. And that's a seismic shift in terms of the problem set that we are now looking at. What I worry about is this idea that when we look at, there are many circles, we look at China and Russia, and we tend to sort of paint them with this authoritarian brush. And we sort of reduce their actions as, well, these are just authoritarian leaders. And, whether it's military action, whether it's competitive economic action, we tend to not understand that there are new political ideologies behind those regimes. And so there's a new ideological competition. When the Cold War ended, we essentially dismissed ideology as not existing at all. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, because ideology is back and it's here to stay. If we're going to win great power competition, we have to understand the systems of belief, and we have to understand the new political ideologies that are truly networked today inside of those countries with global implications. And I think sort of just painting them as authoritarian regimes doesn't answer the question, and actually reduces the problem.
Incredible, and it's so incredibly complex at this moment, isn't it? With
It really is.
Planet shrinking literally with the digital conversation taking place. It's, there's not one source of information, i.e., way back when we had one source for health information. In a sense, we had the U.S. Surgeon General. Now we have so many different sources. There's not one place to go. And we at Ideagen, as you know, Jake, look at the issue of cross-sector collaboration is extremely important. In tandem with what you're describing, which is foresight. You can't have foresight unless you understand what is happening to help create that vision of a future. And so the ability to understand what's happening in a 360-degree fashion is critically important to make accurate predictions and planning. And so as you look at the sectors, including the private and the NGOs, obviously the public sector that you work with, how are you as a futurist looking at these key elements for planning?
George, absolutely. That's a great question. You really can't do a futures outlook. You can't have a foresight portfolio if you aren't prepared to understand the complexities that span a myriad of sectors: the scientific sector, the technological sector, the economic sector, ecological factors, and of course, political, right? So you've got to be able to look at the weak signals that are coming out of each one of those areas and then sort of weave those together to be able to tell a compelling story. One of the issues that I mentioned to you previously was this question of ideology, right? And so, it's not only for great power competition, but it's also for how the United States will conduct planning and our assumptions on our alliance structure in the future. And so the example that I've used previously, and I actually just had a discussion about this a few weeks ago, was we looked at this idea of how is political ideology actually affecting real dollars and cents. And I often get some eyebrows raised when I say that. And I point to the example, I say, look at the neo-Ottoman ideology that's happening in Turkey today, and which is a staunch NATO ally, which has been with us from the beginning. However, we lost almost over $1 billion by not being able to deliver the F-35 to Turkey, which was driven by internal factors that were largely ideological. And so you can't just look at, for example, defense procurement or supply chains from a completely dollars and cents equation. You have to factor in all of the broader environmental factors, political factors, right, socio-cultural. And that applies as well to the financial sector, that applies to healthcare, it applies to education. And so I think the takeaway is that we live in a globalized world, and most of us, I think, listening understand that. But beyond that reality, we have this converted, and they impact different sectors in a profound way. And I think to look at things in a very narrow lens and only look at our area of focus limits our ability to craft alternative futures. And that's ultimately what we want to do to make better decisions.
What an incredible example. And I'm very familiar with that example. I think the ability to consider those elements as part of your planning process is absolutely vital. And so why do you see the whole notion of effective leadership combined with innovation so important to help address so many of the vexing issues like you just described?
Yeah, I mean, I think those issues are really complementary. As a military member, one of the things we really place a premium on is the ability to lead people, the ability to inspire people, because a lot of the decisions that are made in the military are life and death decisions, and they're tough decisions. And so I think I've had the benefit of working for some really phenomenal leaders, right? And probably like all of us, also some not so great leaders. And you take those lessons away and you want to learn from them and basically pay it forward and make sure that as you lead individuals, that you're giving that good example as well. In terms of innovation, I think good leadership really inspires innovation. Good leaders understand that they don't know everything. They can't possibly have expertise in all areas. And a great example is, when I came into our organization last year, having the benefit of this Foresight education and the Air Force having invested a lot of time and resources and education for me to go and study and get a Ph.D. in this, I came to my leadership and said, I think we need to stand up this capability. We need to apply this modicum of thinking to our current mission sets. And to their credit, they said, absolutely. We don't necessarily understand all the nuts and bolts of what you're doing, but we can see that there's value to this. And I really appreciate that. And I think that's a great example of, leadership in action and taking an idea and letting your folks run with it and letting them bring back results that ultimately benefit the organization and in this case, the nation as a whole.
Yeah, that is just tremendous to be able to know that the leadership in the United States Air Force values, the strategic foresight. I mean, as a citizen and as a leader of Ideagen, I think it's really incredible and awesome. All of the wonderful words that can bring us to that. At Ideagen, as you know, Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, you know that cross-sector collaboration is critical and that centerpiece of everything that we do. In addition, we like to keep as a virtual backdrop the 17 global goals of the United Nations. Why? Because they're not political. They were agreed to by every single member of the United Nations. All 193 member states agreed to the goals. And it's things, as you know, like the economic empowerment of women and girls, or global partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great way for us to frame conversations to help address many of the world's most vexing issues. And I'd like to better understand how you in your role at the United States Air Force infuse cross-sector collaboration into your daily mission.
Yeah, absolutely, George. So, one of the critical components of what we're doing in terms of designing the future force, when we're envisioning what's the Air Force going to look like in 2035 and beyond, what's the Joint Force going to look like, and more importantly, what role are we going to play in the broader national security apparatus? What do we bring to the table? Which capability are we going to need to be able to answer the nation's call, right? There really couldn't be a better pitch for foresight and futures than that. And the UN Sustainable Goals, as you just mentioned, really make the case for future studies. I mean, that there couldn't be a better poster child. Everything about them describes a better world that I think we all want to live in. We all want more equality. We all want to have reduced poverty. And now, while some of those issues are outside of the scope of the Defense Department, I think it speaks to the value that foresight and futures can bring to the NGO sector, to the economic sector, to governance. One of the things that I talked about yesterday in another call was that when we look at what's happening now, and we are this digital country with everybody operating like we are right now, what does that do for the future of governance? Are we going to see things like everybody carries around a smartphone? Are we going to start voting? Is there more of a democratization coming basically enabled by technology? I don't know. I think that's one thing that we might think about. How are we making decisions collectively? How can we actually have more democracy enabled by technology? These are things that many of us are considering now and thinking of as we look to the future. And I think there are many alternative future scenarios that are going to come out of this. And I think if nothing else, it certainly raises the awareness that we have to always consider the possibilities that environmental factors are going to be there, and we need to understand how they might impact our assumptions, our core assumptions.
Well, I go back to where we started it in this interview, which was, it's striking, but it's elementary. But it's something that perhaps none of us consider, perhaps except yourself, because you study this each and every day. The notion that the future doesn't exist. I mean, that's profound, right? I mean, when you think about it, we all are moving at warp speed, even on a digital basis. Everyone it continues to be busy that has digital engagement in a strategy. We happen to have had a strategy in place thinking about the future and thinking about engaging digitally. We launched TV prior to Ideagen TV prior to anything happening with this global pandemic, not knowing what would happen or whether anything would happen. And here we are today on Ideagen TV talking about elements of the future. But the way you describe it, I think really causes you to pause for a moment to think that the future doesn't exist. And that if I've heard a lot. Are sitting. We ask a question, Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, that is simple but yet also profound in each and every interview with global leaders like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that question is simply, what are the 3 key lessons you have learned that have the potential to change the world?
Well, I think I'd go back to what I talked about before, which is some of the lessons that I learned from my grandparents that I think are really unchangeable. And I think most of us would agree, for me, number one, respect for people. I've had the good fortune of traveling around the world in this career. When I was a senior in high school, got a chance to spend an entire year in the former East Germany, learning German and basically being immersed in a new culture. And that experience really colored my life's work in terms of getting to know people and understanding why they think the way that they do. But more importantly, it's the fact whether they are educated or they're not educated. And I don't believe that I don't like the term uneducated people. I think everybody has a story to tell. And formal education isn't the only thing that matters. I tell you what, both my grandfathers never finished college, and one of them, I think, finished 3rd grade in Greece, but he was the smartest man that I have ever known and with brilliant business instincts. And so that the respect for everyone, no matter what their background is or where they come from, I think that's a really important thing. And that ultimately is what we need more of in the world.
Hear, hear.
The second part I would mention, I think kind of touches on the first one, which is, I think, the willingness to get out and learn about the world, learn foreign languages, and immerse yourself in another culture. Because when you do that, you're not only learning a language, but you're also making a true live connection with other people's culture that really isn't, it's hard to describe the connection that comes out of that, especially when it's not necessarily your heritage or your culture. The fact that you take the time and you express interest, I think that really gains respect, but it also shows your willingness to really embrace the other person's difference. And I think that's a profound thing that we need more of. And finally, I would say really it's humility. Good leaders ultimately are humble leaders, and they recognize where to give credit. And like I said before, I think good leaders who are humble can inspire innovation because they create an environment that's really conducive for ideas to flow. And I think it was General Colin Powell who said, when people stop bringing you problems, that's when you really need to start worrying, right? Because that means that they don't trust that you care enough to listen to them anymore. And so I think that very healthy dose of humility in all that we do really makes a difference. And those are lessons I think that aren't restricted to any field. Those can be applied, I think, in a broad sense and definitely towards making the world a better place.
Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, what an incredible, inspiring, and very relevant interview today with you. What is up next for you, and how can individuals across the planet find out more about your work as Chief of Strategic Foresight and Futures Analytics at the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability?
Well, George, as you might imagine, we've got our work cut out for us right now. And so what's next is essentially doing our mission, our day-to-day mission, doing our job for the American people, working hard, I think, to try to see these weak signals that are emerging now. And really our task in the real near term is what does geopolitical competition look like in a post-COVID-19 world? What kinds of things do we need to be preparing for? more importantly, what kinds of acquisitions, what kinds of equipment are we going to need? What kinds of human capital skills do we need to develop? That whole equation needs to be part of the discussion. And I know that this current situation will be a catalyst for driving a lot of those topics. For folks wanting to look at more of our work, you can go to certainly on LinkedIn. I've got a LinkedIn website or LinkedIn profile, which is just Jake.Sotiriadis. If we can get that posted, and then also we've got a website which is for the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability. The acronym is AFWIC, and folks can do a Google search for AFWIC and look at the AFWIC website as well to see all the great things that are happening and the great work in design thinking towards building that joint force and Air Force of tomorrow.
It is profound. It is incredible to have had you on the show today. I speak on behalf of everyone who's listening and watching today. A note of deep gratitude, especially a deep thanks from Ideagen and our entire global community for your service.
George, thank you very much. And I really appreciate being here for the interview and hope everybody stays safe and healthy.
God bless America. Ideagenglobal.com, powered by Azure, exclusively on LinkedIn Live. Dr. Jake Sotiriadis. Thank you.
Thank you.